He vanished without a trace. No goodbye. No warning. No signs that he intended to leave his life behind. His watch was still inside the apartment. His pocket knife had been left behind. His paychecks were never cashed. And for nearly 2 decades, nobody knew where Fred Wilkerson had gone. Friends whispered. Neighbors speculated. Detectives chased dead ends. Some believed he had simply started over somewhere else. Others believed something much darker had happened. But the truth had been buried in the Georgia countryside the entire time. And when investigators finally uncovered what had happened, they would discover that one woman had managed to keep a deadly secret hidden for 17 years. Before we uncover this shocking case, make sure to like the video, leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and hit the subscribe button for Cold Case 247 so you never miss another true crime investigation. The story begins in 1987. Tim Wilkerson was only 18 years old. He and his father, Fred Wilkerson, were extremely close. They lived together, looked out for each other, and shared a routine that had become second nature. Whenever one of them left home, they always left a note. It didn't matter whether they were running to the store or leaving for work. They wanted the other person to know where they were. That simple habit had never changed. So when Tim came home one night and found that his father was gone, something immediately felt wrong. Fred's car wasn't there. But what bothered Tim most was the silence. There was no note. Nothing written on the counter. Nothing on the refrigerator. Nothing to explain where Fred had gone. At first, Tim tried not to panic. Maybe his father had stepped out unexpectedly. Maybe something had come up. But as the hours passed, his concern grew stronger. This wasn't normal. Fred wasn't the type of person to disappear without telling someone. And the longer he remained missing, the more Tim feared the unthinkable. Investigators responded to the apartment and began looking for answers. Inside, they noticed something strange. Fred's personal belongings had been left behind. His watch. His pocket knife. Items he used every day. It looked as though he had intended to return within minutes. Nothing suggested that he had packed up and left voluntarily. As the weekend passed, another troubling fact emerged. Fred had failed to show up for work. People who knew him understood that this wasn't like him. He was responsible and dependable. Missing work without any explanation was completely out of character. His family began fearing the worst. Weeks went by with no answers. Then, on Christmas Eve, investigators received a major break. Fred's car had been discovered at the Atlanta airport. At first glance, the vehicle appeared abandoned. A thick layer of dust covered the exterior. It looked as though nobody had touched it for weeks. Crime scene technicians carefully examined the vehicle. But what they found made very little sense. There were no fingerprints. Nothing useful. Almost as if someone had intentionally wiped everything clean. Then investigators found something even more disturbing. Inside the car were 2 uncashed payroll checks belonging to Fred. That discovery raised serious questions. If he had decided to leave on his own, why would he abandon money? Why would he leave without collecting his earnings? And if he had boarded a plane, where had he gone? Detectives searched airline records. They found nothing. No evidence that Fred had taken a flight. No indication that he had traveled anywhere. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. As investigators spoke with Tim, one name quickly entered the conversation. Connie Cadence. She had once been involved with Fred. But according to Tim, the relationship had ended badly. Years earlier, the two had purchased a ranch home sitting on 14 acres in Georgia. Their names had both been connected to the property. Tim explained that his father had agreed to transfer his interest to Connie to help her regain custody of her children. Fred trusted her. He believed she would eventually transfer his share back to him. But according to Tim, that never happened. Instead, the relationship fell apart. Connie forced Fred out of the house. Soon, their once close relationship turned bitter. Fred believed he had been deceived. And eventually, he decided to fight back. Just 2 days before disappearing, Fred filed a lawsuit against Connie. He wanted to recover the money he had invested in the property. For detectives, the timing was impossible to ignore. A legal battle had just begun. Emotions were high. Money was involved. And now one of the people at the center of the dispute had vanished. When investigators questioned Connie, she denied being romantically involved with Fred. According to her, their relationship had been strictly business. She claimed Fred had only stayed at the house because he was working on it as a contractor. She insisted the home had always belonged to her. And she denied any involvement in his disappearance. But despite their suspicions, detectives had nothing to prove otherwise. No witnesses. No body. No crime scene. And no physical evidence. Without evidence, there was little they could do. Months turned into years. Fred's bank accounts remained untouched. His social security number showed no activity. Every reported sighting turned out to be false. Eventually, the case grew cold. For many people, Fred Wilkerson became just another missing person whose fate might never be known. But in the small town of LaGrange, rumors never disappeared. People talked. Whispers spread. And one particular rumor continued to surface again and again. Some residents believed that Fred had been murdered. And many believed the answer was somewhere on Connie Quaden's property. Still, years passed with no proof. Then, in the mid-1990s, something happened that reignited suspicions. Connie hired workers to fill an old abandoned well located on her property. To some people, that decision seemed innocent. But to others, it raised disturbing questions. Why fill the well? Why now? Tim Wilkerson immediately became suspicious. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. Before long, another shocking development occurred. Connie filed legal documents asking the court to officially declare Fred dead. For Tim and the rest of the family, the move felt devastating. They had never stopped hoping. And now someone else was trying to legally close the chapter. But Connie had something to gain. She had continued making payments on a life insurance policy connected to Fred. After a judge declared him legally dead, she received $12,000. The mystery only deepened. Still, no evidence connected anyone to murder. No arrests were made. And once again, the case faded into silence. But fate has a strange way of bringing buried secrets back to the surface. And years later, an unexpected storm would set in motion the events that would finally expose the truth. Little did anyone know, the biggest break in the case was still waiting. And after nearly 2 decades, justice was preparing to wake up. In the spring of 2003, a powerful storm swept through LaGrange, Georgia. For most people, it was just another thunderstorm. But for District Attorney Pete Skandalakis, it became something he would never forget. When the storm ended, he walked outside and discovered that a massive pine tree had crashed directly onto his brand new pickup truck. Instead of becoming angry, he simply laughed. At the time, he had no idea that the damaged truck would lead him straight into one of the most haunting mysteries in the county. Needing repairs, he brought the vehicle to a local body shop. The owner of that body shop was Tim Wilkerson. The same Tim Wilkerson who had spent nearly 16 years wondering what had happened to his father. As Tim shared his story, something about the case stayed with Skandalakis. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that Fred Wilkerson had not disappeared voluntarily. He believed that somewhere inside those dusty old files, the truth was waiting. Soon, Special Investigator Clay Bryant was assigned to take another look. The case had sat untouched for years. Boxes filled with reports and notes had gathered dust. Many people believed there was nothing left to find. But Bryant approached the investigation with fresh eyes. He met with Fred's family. He listened carefully. And after spending time with them, he reached one conclusion. Fred Wilkerson had most likely met with foul play. Now Bryant needed evidence. He began reviewing every lead that had been collected over the years. Most had gone nowhere. But one name immediately caught his attention. Lisa Halderman. Tim had mentioned her almost immediately. Years earlier, she had attempted to contact the family's attorney, claiming she possessed information related to Fred's disappearance. At the time, investigators had been unable to locate her. And eventually, the lead went cold. But Bryant wasn't willing to let that happen again. He tracked her down. Now known as Lisa Halderman Miles, she was surprised when investigators finally contacted her. And what she told them would change everything. Lisa remembered reading about Fred Wilkerson in the newspaper years earlier. The entire town had been talking about the case. But one particular detail caught her attention. The article mentioned that Fred's car had been discovered at the Atlanta airport. Suddenly, a memory she had nearly forgotten came rushing back. Back in 1987, around the time Fred disappeared, Connie K. Denz had asked her for a favor. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. At least not at the time. Connie simply asked if she could drive to Atlanta and pick her up near the airport. Lisa agreed. When she arrived, Connie was waiting. She picked her up and drove home. It seemed harmless. Years later, after reading that Fred's car had been found abandoned at the airport, Lisa began wondering if the trip she had taken all those years ago had been connected somehow. The realization disturbed her. And now, after all these years, she was finally sharing that information with investigators. Bryant listened carefully. Then he asked her another question. Did she have any idea where Fred might be? Lisa's answer was chilling. She told him she believed the same thing many people around town believed. That Fred Wilkerson was inside the well on Connie's property. For years, rumors had surrounded that old well. People whispered about it. Neighbors discussed it. But nobody had ever searched it. Not thoroughly. Now, armed with fresh information, investigators decided they could no longer ignore it. Search warrants were obtained. Heavy equipment was brought in. And nearly 16 years after Fred vanished, the earth itself was about to reveal its secrets. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this unbelievable story. Investigators arrived at Connie Quaden's property. Excavation equipment stood ready. Nearby, officers prepared for what they might find. As crews began digging, Clay Bryant stayed inside the house with Connie. He confronted her with Lisa's story. He told her they had spoken with a witness. Someone who claimed she had picked Connie up from the airport around the time Fred disappeared. The reaction was immediate. Connie suddenly became emotional. And then she said something investigators had waited almost 17 years to hear. She admitted that she had driven Fred's car to the airport. But she insisted she had not killed him. Those words stunned investigators. For years, she had denied any connection to the abandoned vehicle. Now, she had placed herself directly inside the mystery. And outside, the digging continued. Minutes passed. Then came a discovery. Nearly 20 feet below the ground, investigators noticed something unusual. Work immediately stopped. Everyone gathered around. Carefully, they began examining what had been uncovered. What they found sent shockwaves through the investigation. Human remains. After nearly 17 years, Fred Wilkerson had finally been found. The truth had been buried beneath that property all along. The remains were removed and examined. Investigators discovered evidence that pointed to a horrifying end. Fred had been shot once in the back of the head. The mystery that had haunted his family for almost 2 decades had finally been solved. But one question remained. Would investigators be able to prove who was responsible? And would the Wilkerson family finally receive the justice they had waited 17 years to see? Those answers would soon be decided inside a courtroom, where a jury would hear the evidence and determine whether Connie K. Dens had gotten away with murder for far too long. News of the discovery spread quickly throughout Troup County. For years, many people had whispered about the old well. Some dismissed the rumors as gossip. Others believed the truth had been hiding there all along. Now, after nearly 17 years, those rumors had turned into reality. For Tim Wilkerson and the rest of the family, the emotions were overwhelming. They had never stopped searching for answers. There had been birthdays, holidays, and countless family gatherings without Fred. Years had passed, but the pain of not knowing had never disappeared. Now they finally knew. But knowing what had happened brought a different kind of heartbreak. Fred Wilkerson had not abandoned his family. He had not started a new life somewhere else. He had not walked away. His life had been stolen. Investigators worked carefully to piece together the final moments of Fred's life. Every statement. Every old report. Every forgotten detail suddenly became important again. The evidence showed that Fred had disappeared just days after filing a lawsuit against Connie K. Dens. The lawsuit centered around the property they once shared. According to family members, Fred believed he had been betrayed. He had trusted Connie. He believed she would honor their agreement. Instead, the relationship collapsed into resentment and legal battles. Investigators believed the dispute over the property provided a motive. And now, with the discovery of Fred's remains and Connie's own admission that she had driven his car to the Atlanta airport, prosecutors believed they had enough to move forward. Connie K. Dens was arrested and charged with murder. For the Wilkerson family, the arrest marked the end of one chapter. But another difficult chapter was just beginning. They had waited almost 2 decades for answers. Now they faced the painful process of reliving everything inside a courtroom. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to present years of evidence. The passage of time had created challenges. Witnesses had aged. Memories had faded. Some evidence had been lost to time. But investigators believed the truth remained clear. The prosecution argued that Connie had carefully concealed the crime. For years, she managed to avoid suspicion. She had hidden the body. She had continued paying the life insurance premiums. And after 7 years, she successfully petitioned the court to declare Fred legally dead. Soon afterward, she collected $12,000 from the policy. Prosecutors believed that wasn't coincidence. They believed it was part of a much larger deception. Meanwhile, Connie's defense team prepared its own arguments. They claimed there were unanswered questions. They argued that there was no eyewitness to the murder itself. And they challenged parts of the prosecution's theory. But for the Wilkerson family, one fact could not be ignored. Fred had been found inside the well located on Connie's property. And she herself had admitted to taking his car to the airport. As the trial began, the courtroom became the center of attention. Witnesses took the stand. Investigators described reopening the cold case. Clay Bryant explained how forgotten leads eventually brought them to Lisa Holderman Miles. Lisa testified about the ride to the airport so many years earlier. And prosecutors carefully connected each piece of the puzzle. For Tim Wilkerson, sitting inside that courtroom was difficult. He had spent years wondering whether justice would ever come. Now, he was finally watching the truth unfold before a jury. Day after day, testimony continued. Photographs were introduced. Investigators described the search of the property. Experts explained the examination of the remains. And throughout it all, the memory of Fred Wilkerson remained at the center of the case. Eventually, both sides rested. Closing arguments were delivered. Then everyone waited. 17 years had passed since Fred disappeared. Now, his family faced one final wait. The fate of Connie K. Dens rested in the hands of 12 jurors. Hours felt like days. The anxiety inside the courtroom was impossible to ignore. Finally, the jury reached its decision. Connie K. Dens was found guilty of murder. For Tim Wilkerson and his family, the verdict brought emotions that were difficult to describe. Nothing could bring Fred back. Nothing could replace the years they had lost. But after nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, they finally had answers. Justice had been served. Connie K. Dens received a life sentence. Under Georgia laws in effect at the time of the crime, she would eventually become eligible for parole. But many involved in the case believed that the years she had spent avoiding responsibility would weigh heavily when parole decisions were considered. For investigators, the case became a reminder that time does not always bury the truth. Sometimes, the truth waits patiently. Sometimes, it takes years. And sometimes, the smallest event can change everything. A storm damaged a truck. A conversation reopened a forgotten file. A witness remembered something she had almost forgotten. And an old abandoned well revealed a secret that had been hidden for nearly 17 years. Fred Wilkerson's story became one of Georgia's most remarkable cold cases. Not because the crime was perfect, but because justice refused to disappear. No matter how much time passed. No matter how deeply the truth had been buried. Someone kept searching. Someone kept asking questions. And eventually, the truth came to light. Cases like this remind us that behind every missing person's file is a family waiting for answers. A son waiting for his father. Loved ones holding on to hope. And investigators who refuse to let the silence win. Thank you for spending time with us here on Cold Case 247. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to see more real-life true crime cases, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another investigation. And before you go, tell us in the comments, do you believe this case would have ever been solved if that storm had never damaged the district attorney's truck? Until next time, stay safe, and remember, no secret stays buried forever.